Jake Dawson was a seasoned long-haul trucker, a man who had spent more time on the open road than he had in his own home. He loved the solitude of the highways, the endless miles stretching out before him, and the quiet hum of the engine as his only companion. But there was one stretch of road he avoided whenever he could: Dead Man's Pass. Dead Man's Pass was a treacherous, winding road that cut through the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. It was notorious among truckers for its sharp turns, steep cliffs, and the eerie stories that surrounded it. Legends of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and trucks that vanished without a trace had been circulating among drivers for decades. But Jake didn't believe in ghosts until one fateful night changed his mind forever. It was a cold December evening when Jake received an urgent call from his dispatcher. A shipment of medical supplies needed to be delivered to a hospital in Denver by morning, and the quickest route was through Dead Man's Pass. Jake hesitated for a moment, his mind flashing back to the stories he had heard, but he had never been one to shy away from a challenge. He agreed to take the load, telling himself the tales were just that: stories. Jake set out from Salt Lake City as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow-covered landscape. The weather was clear, but as he approached the pass, the sky began to darken with thick, ominous clouds. The first snowflakes began to fall as he started the climb, the road twisting and turning beneath his wheels. As he ascended, the snow intensified, quickly turning into a blizzard. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the road became slick with ice. Jake gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he carefully navigated the treacherous terrain. The CB radio crackled with static, the voices of other truckers lost in the storm. Then, just as he rounded a particularly sharp bend, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. In the middle of the road, barely visible through the swirling snow, stood a figure, a man, dressed in an old-fashioned trucker's uniform, his face obscured by the brim of a weathered cap. Jake slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the ice as the truck came to a shuddering stop, just inches from the man. Heart pounding, Jake leaned out the window, shouting into the storm, "Hey, you need help?" The man didn't move, didn't even acknowledge Jake's presence. He just stood there, silent and still, as the snow piled up around him. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Before Jake could react, the man slowly lifted his head, revealing a face that Jake would never forget. It was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. The man's lips twisted into a cruel smile, and then he vanished, just disappeared into thin air, leaving only the howling wind in his wake. Jake's heart raced as he tried to process what he had just seen. Ghosts weren't real, he told himself, but there was no other explanation. He had seen the man, seen him clear as day, and then he was gone. Panic set in, and Jake knew he had to get off that mountain as quickly as possible. He put the truck in gear and pressed on, his eyes darting nervously between the road and his mirrors, half expecting the ghostly figure to reappear at any moment. The snow was now falling in thick sheets, the road barely visible beneath the white blanket. Jake's breath fogged the windshield, his hands slick with sweat, despite the freezing temperature. Suddenly, the radio burst to life, a voice crackling through the static. "Breaker, breaker, this is Big Red. Anyone out there?" Jake grabbed the mic, desperate for any human contact. "Big Red, this is Black Jack. You hear me?" There was a pause, and then the voice came through again, clearer this time. "Black Jack, you're in the pass, aren't you?" Jake frowned. "Yeah. How'd you know?" Another pause. "Get out of there, Jack. Get out now, before it's too late." Jake's blood ran cold. "What the hell are you talking about?" But before Big Red could respond, the radio went dead again, the static fading into an eerie silence. Jake was on his own. He pressed down on the accelerator, his truck struggling up the icy incline. The storm was relentless, the snow blinding, but he had to keep moving. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, something unseen but close, too close. And then he heard it, a low rumbling sound, like distant thunder, but somehow more menacing. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right on top of him. Jake glanced in his mirrors, but all he could see was the swirling snow, an endless white void that threatened to swallow him whole. The rumbling grew louder still, until it was a deafening roar. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what it was, the sound of another truck, barreling down the mountain, out of control, and headed straight for him. He slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding wildly on the ice as he fought to regain control. But it was too late. The truck behind him was closing in fast, its headlights cutting through the storm like twin daggers. Jake braced himself for impact, knowing there was no way out. But just as the truck was about to collide with him, it swerved violently to the right, its tires screeching on the ice. It missed Jake by inches, crashing through the guardrail and plunging over the cliff. Jake watched in horror as the truck disappeared into the abyss, its headlights fading into the darkness below. Shaking, Jake pulled over to the side of the road, his heart pounding in his ears. He fumbled for the radio, his hands trembling. "Big Red, anyone, did you see that?" The radio crackled back to life, Big Red's voice filled with an edge of urgency. "Get out of there, Jack. That wasn't no truck." Jake froze, the words sending a chill down his spine. "What do you mean?" "It's him, the ghost trucker. They say he haunts these roads, looking for drivers to take with him. You gotta get out, now." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He put the truck in gear and tore down the mountain, the engine roaring as he pushed it to its limits. The storm raged on, but Jake didn't care. He had to get away, had to escape whatever was out there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake cleared the pass, the snow easing up as he descended into the valley below. The road straightened out, and the storm began to dissipate, the stars peeking through the clouds. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following him, something that wouldn't stop until it had him. He drove all night, not stopping until he reached the safety of the truck stop on the outskirts of Denver. As he pulled in, exhausted and shaken, he noticed something strange. On the side of his truck, etched into the frost, were the words, "You can't outrun the dead." Jake never drove Dead Man's Pass again. But the memory of that night haunted him, a chilling reminder that some roads are cursed, and some ghosts never rest. Tom Keller was a veteran truck driver, a man who had seen every corner of the American highways. He had driven through snowstorms in Montana, torrential rain in Louisiana, and blistering heat in Arizona. But nothing had ever shaken him until that night on Route 66. It was a cold, moonless night in November. Tom had picked up a late load in Amarillo, Texas, and was heading west, bound for California. The road was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual chatter on the CB radio had died down, and even the occasional car had disappeared. Tom was alone, with only the hum of his rig and the faint sound of classic rock playing on the radio. As he drove deeper into the desert, he noticed something strange. The temperature gauge on his dashboard started to drop rapidly. It was as if the warmth was being sucked out of the air. He turned up the heater, but the cab only grew colder. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a faint glow on the horizon. At first, he thought it was a town, but as he got closer, the glow dimmed until it was nothing but a pale mist, hovering just above the ground. Tom slowed down, his instincts telling him something was wrong. Suddenly, the mist thickened, enveloping his truck. Tom couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and the road disappeared beneath him. He reached for the CB radio, but all he got was static. Panic started to creep in. This was no ordinary fog. Out of the mist, a figure appeared. Tom slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the truck's headlights. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her long black hair matted and hanging over her face. Tom's hand shook as he reached for the door handle, but something inside him screamed not to get out. The woman started to move towards the truck, slowly at first, then faster, her bare feet gliding over the asphalt without a sound. As she got closer, Tom could see her face, or rather, the absence of it. Her features were twisted, almost melted, like a wax figure left in the sun too long. Her eyes were hollow pits, filled with an inky darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Tom hit the gas, but the truck wouldn't move. It was as if the wheels were glued to the ground. The woman was now at the driver's side window, her hollow eyes locked onto Tom's. She raised a hand and placed it on the glass, leaving a bloody smear as her hand slid down. Suddenly, the truck roared back to life. Tom didn't hesitate. He floored it, the engine screaming as he tore through the mist. The woman disappeared into the fog, but the cold remained, biting into Tom's skin, despite the heater blasting at full force. He drove for miles, the mist gradually thinning until it was just a memory. The temperature gauge crept back up to normal, and the night seemed to return to its usual calm. Tom tried to shake off the terror, convincing himself it was just a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, he knew better. Finally, Tom reached a truck stop on the outskirts of a small desert town. He pulled in, his hands still trembling. The place was almost deserted, except for a few other rigs parked in the lot. He stumbled out of his truck, desperate for a cup of coffee and some human company. Inside the diner, the waitress, an older woman with a kind smile, poured him a hot cup of coffee. She looked at him with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost, honey," she said. Tom forced a smile, trying to laugh it off, but the words caught in his throat. "I think I did," he finally muttered, more to himself than to her. The waitress's smile faded. She glanced around, making sure no one was listening, then leaned in close. "You were on Route 66, weren't you?" she whispered. Tom nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. The waitress sighed. "You're not the first. Truckers have been seeing her for years. They say she was killed on that road, hitchhiking one night when a trucker ran her down. No one ever found out who did it. Some folks think she's still out there, looking for the man who killed her, trying to get her revenge." Tom stared into his coffee, the liquid rippling as his hand shook. He wanted to leave, to get back on the road and put as much distance between himself and Route 66 as possible. But something kept him rooted to the spot. "I saw her," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She was right there, right at my window. She touched my truck." The waitress nodded solemnly. "You're lucky you got away. Some don't. They say if she gets into your truck, you never make it out of that mist." Tom finished his coffee in silence, the warmth doing little to chase away the cold that had settled in his bones. He left the diner, his mind racing with thoughts of the ghostly woman and the mist that had nearly swallowed him whole. As he climbed back into his truck, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the driver's side window, where the woman had touched, was a bloody handprint. It was smeared, as if someone had tried to wipe it away, but it was still there. a dark reminder of what he had seen. Tom left the truck stop and continued his journey, but he never drove Route 66 at night again. The memory of that night haunted him for the rest of his life, a ghostly reminder that some roads are best left untraveled. And every now and then, when he was alone in the cab, he would feel a sudden chill, and he knew she was still out there, waiting. Jimmy Harris had been driving trucks for nearly 20 years. He was a man of the road, a lone wolf who preferred the company of his 18-wheeler over people. He had seen everything, the strange, the beautiful, and the dangerous. But nothing compared to what he encountered one cold October night on Hollow Road. Hollow Road was an old, narrow stretch of highway in West Virginia, winding through dense forests and overgrown with legends. Truckers avoided it whenever possible, citing stories of strange occurrences, mysterious disappearances, and a curse that dated back centuries. But Jimmy was behind on a deadline and figured the shortcut would shave a couple of hours off his route. He didn't believe in ghost stories anyway. It was just after midnight when Jimmy turned onto Hollow Road. The moon was full, but the thick canopy of trees overhead turned the road into a tunnel of shadows. Fog clung to the asphalt like a shroud, and the air felt heavy, as if it was pressing down on his truck. He flicked on his high beams, but they barely cut through the darkness. The first sign of trouble came as a low rumble in the distance. At first, Jimmy thought it was thunder, but the sky was clear. The rumbling grew louder, more distinct, like the sound of an engine. A big one. It was coming from behind him. Jimmy checked his mirrors, but saw nothing except the thick fog swirling in his taillights. He shrugged it off, figuring it was just another trucker far behind. But the sound kept getting closer, the roar of the engine growing louder and more menacing with each passing second. Suddenly, a massive black truck appeared in his rearview mirror, its headlights blazing like the eyes of a demon. The truck was gaining on him fast, far too fast for the narrow, winding road. Jimmy's heart pounded as he gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. There was no room to pull over, no way to let the truck pass. The black truck was almost on top of him now, its headlights so bright they lit up the entire cab. Jimmy could feel the heat of the engine behind him, the growl of the diesel, like a beast ready to devour him. Panic set in as he floored the accelerator, trying to outrun the monstrous truck. But no matter how fast Jimmy drove, the black truck stayed right on his tail, its horn blaring like a banshee's scream. Jimmy's truck shuddered as he took a sharp turn at breakneck speed, the tires skidding on the slick road. For a moment, he thought he was going to lose control, but somehow, he managed to keep the rig on the road. Just when Jimmy thought the black truck was going to ram into him, it suddenly swerved to the side, disappearing into the trees. Jimmy slammed on the brakes, his heart racing, as he searched the road for any sign of the truck. But there was nothing. No tire marks, no headlights, no sound. It was as if the truck had never existed. Shaken, Jimmy took a deep breath and started driving again, his hands trembling on the wheel. He tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the fog, maybe a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, he knew better. Something wasn't right about Hollow Road. As he continued down the highway, the fog grew thicker, wrapping around the truck like a living thing. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Jimmy could feel the temperature drop, the air turning so cold it seemed to seep into his bones. He turned up the heat, but it did nothing to chase away the chill. And then, without warning, his truck's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered, and the dashboard lights went out, plunging him into darkness. Jimmy cursed under his breath as he coasted to a stop. He tried the ignition again, but the engine refused to turn over. He was stranded. Jimmy reached for his CB radio, hoping to call for help, but all he got was static. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and impenetrable. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the truck as it settled on its suspension. He felt utterly alone. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the side of the truck. Jimmy jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. Another thud, this time on the roof. It sounded like something heavy was moving around up there, something that didn't belong. Jimmy grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and slowly opened the door, stepping out into the freezing fog. He shone the light around, but it barely penetrated the dense mist. The truck loomed beside him like a ghostly behemoth, its once familiar shape now menacing and foreign. He walked around to the front of the truck, shining the light up at the roof. There was nothing there. No sign of whatever had made the noise. He was about to turn back when he heard it again. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the trees. Jimmy froze, his breath visible in the cold night air. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once, urging him to come closer. His legs felt like they were moving on their own as he stepped towards the trees, the flashlight flickering as if the batteries were dying. Just as he reached the edge of the forest, the whispers stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it felt like the world had been muted. Jimmy stood there, heart pounding, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then he saw them. Dozens of figures, barely visible in the fog, standing just inside the tree line. They were tall and thin, their bodies wrapped in shadows, their faces obscured, but their eyes, those eyes glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light, piercing the darkness like daggers. Jimmy stumbled back, his flashlight falling from his hand as the figures began to move towards him, their steps slow and deliberate. He turned and ran, his boots slipping on the wet ground as he scrambled back to the truck. He could hear the figures behind him, their footsteps growing louder, closer. He reached the truck and threw himself into the cab, slamming the door shut just as the first of the figures emerged from the fog. Jimmy frantically tried the ignition again, and to his surprise, the engine roared to life. He didn't waste a second, shifting into gear and tearing down the road, the truck fishtailing on the slick pavement. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The figures were standing in the middle of the road, watching him, their glowing eyes following him as he disappeared into the night. Jimmy didn't stop until he was miles away, the fog finally lifting as he neared the next town. He pulled into a truck stop, his hands shaking as he parked the rig. He didn't sleep that night, too haunted by the memory of those eyes, those whispers. When the sun finally rose, Jimmy knew one thing for sure: he would never drive Hollow Road again. The next day, Jimmy tried to tell his story to the other truckers at the stop, but they just laughed, dismissing it as exhaustion or a wild imagination. But Jimmy knew what he had seen, what he had heard. He could still feel the cold in his bones, still hear the whispers in his ears, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw those figures standing in the fog, waiting, watching. He knew they were still out there, on Hollow Road, waiting for their next victim. Ben Parker was a long-haul trucker, a man who lived for the open road. After 15 years behind the wheel, he'd seen his share of strange things, but nothing ever fazed him. He was the kind of guy who laughed at ghost stories and rolled his eyes at superstitions. But there was one route he'd never driven, a stretch of highway in the Midwest known as Route 13. Route 13 was notorious among truckers. Tales of eerie sightings, disappearing vehicles, and phantom hitchhikers had made it a legend in the trucking community. But the stories didn't bother Ben. When his dispatcher offered him a job that required driving Route 13 late at night, Ben didn't hesitate. It was just another road, after all. Ben set out from Chicago with a trailer full of electronics bound for Kansas City. The route was straightforward, and he figured he'd be done by morning. As he left the city behind, the sky darkened and a thick fog began to settle over the highway. The GPS directed him onto Route 13, and soon he found himself driving through dense, shadowy woods, the moon barely visible through the clouds. The first few miles were uneventful. The road was quiet, the only sound the steady hum of his truck's engine. But as he got deeper into the forest, the fog thickened, wrapping around his truck like a suffocating blanket. The headlights barely pierced the gloom, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then, out of nowhere, the truck's radio crackled to life. Static buzzed through the speakers, followed by a faint voice that Ben couldn't quite make out. He adjusted the dial, trying to tune it in, but the voice faded, replaced by the low rumble of thunder in the distance. A flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, and Ben saw something that made him slam on the brakes. Standing in the middle of the highway was a woman, her figure barely visible in the fog. She was dressed in an old-fashioned dress, her hair hanging in wet, tangled strands. Ben's heart raced as he stared at her, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring at him with hollow eyes. Ben's first instinct was to get out and help, but something in the back of his mind told him to stay in the truck. He rolled down the window and called out to her, but she didn't respond. The only sound was the rain now falling in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof of the cab. The woman slowly raised her hand, pointing down the road. Ben followed her gaze, squinting through the fog. In the distance, he saw the faint outline of another truck, its taillights flickering like dying embers. It was stopped in the middle of the road, its driver's door hanging open. A chill ran down Ben's spine. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, a deep, primal fear that told him to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But his curiosity got the better of him. He slowly drove forward, his eyes fixed on the stopped truck ahead. As he approached, the woman vanished into the fog, leaving Ben alone with the strange, abandoned truck. He pulled up alongside it and peered inside. The cab was empty, the seats soaked from the rain. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine idling quietly. Ben's heart pounded as he reached for the door handle, his hand trembling. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to leave. But something compelled him to open the door. When he did, a blast of cold air hit him, so cold it felt like it cut right through to his bones. He climbed into the cab, shivering as the cold enveloped him. The interior of the truck was unnaturally cold, far colder than the rainy night outside. Ben looked around, trying to find any sign of the driver. A faint smell of decay hung in the air, making his stomach churn. Then he noticed something strange. The truck's dashboard was covered in frost, and the mirrors were fogged up from the inside. As he reached out to wipe one of the mirrors clear, a hand grabbed his wrist. Ben gasped and jerked back, but no one was there. His heart raced as he stumbled out of the truck, nearly slipping on the wet pavement. He looked around, expecting to see the woman again, but the road was empty. Panicking, Ben rushed back to his own truck and jumped into the cab, slamming the door behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled with the keys, his fingers numb from the cold. He started the engine and floored the accelerator, desperate to get away from that place. As he sped down Route 13, the fog grew thicker, wrapping around the truck like a shroud. The road twisted and turned, the trees closing in on either side. Ben's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the road and the mirrors, half expecting to see the woman or the abandoned truck in his rear view. But the road remained empty, the fog swallowing everything behind him. The radio crackled again, the faint voice returning, more distinct this time. It was a man's voice, barely audible over the static, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Don't look back. Don't look back." Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed the gas pedal harder, the truck roaring as it barreled down the road. The fog was so thick now that he could barely see the road ahead, but he didn't care. He just wanted to get away, to put as much distance between himself and whatever was out there. Suddenly, the truck lurched to a stop, the engine sputtering and dying, as if it had been strangled. Ben's heart sank as he realized he was stuck in the middle of Route 13, with no way to escape. He frantically tried the ignition, but the engine wouldn't turn over. And then, in the silence, he heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from behind the truck. Ben's breath caught in his throat as the footsteps grew louder, closer. He didn't dare look in the mirrors, didn't dare turn around. The footsteps stopped right outside the driver's side door. Ben squeezed his eyes shut, his heart pounding in his ears. He could feel a presence just outside, something dark and cold, something that didn't belong in this world. The door creaked open, and the cold rushed in, freezing the air in his lungs. Ben opened his eyes and turned his head, unable to stop himself. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Standing in the open doorway was the woman, her hollow eyes staring into his soul. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her emaciated frame, and her skin was pale as death. She reached out a hand, her fingers like claws, and touched his cheek. Her touch was ice cold, sending a shock through his body. Ben wanted to scream, to run, but he was paralyzed, trapped in her gaze. The woman leaned in close, her breath freezing on his skin as she whispered in his ear, "You shouldn't have stopped." With that, she vanished, leaving Ben alone in the cab, the door hanging open to the night. The fog began to lift, the road ahead becoming clear once more. The truck's engine roared to life on its own, and Ben, shaking uncontrollably, slammed the door shut and sped away. He didn't stop until he reached the outskirts of Kansas City, the lights of the city, a welcome sight after the terror of Route 13. He pulled into a truck stop, his hands still trembling as he parked the rig. He couldn't shake the cold, couldn't forget the woman's eyes, the touch of her icy hand. Ben never spoke of what happened that night. He quit trucking a few months later, unable to face the road again. But every time he heard the crackle of static on the radio or saw a foggy stretch of road, he remembered. And he knew, deep down, that some roads were best left untraveled. Jake Turner was a veteran trucker, known for taking on routes that no one else would touch. He thrived on the solitude of the open road, the miles of asphalt stretching out before him. But there was one road he had always avoided: Coldwater Pass. Coldwater Pass was an old mountain road in the Rockies, notorious for its sharp turns, steep cliffs, and frequent rock slides. But what made it truly feared were the stories. The tales of truckers who had disappeared, their rigs found abandoned, with no trace of the drivers. Some said it was the ghosts of the miners who had died there in the 1800s. Others whispered of something far older, lurking in the dark. Jake didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in getting the job done, and when a lucrative haul required taking Coldwater Pass to make a tight deadline, he didn't hesitate. The sun was just setting as he began the climb, the sky a deep, bruised purple, and the first stars beginning to appear. The road was rougher than he expected, the pavement cracked and uneven, with jagged rocks jutting out from the mountainside. The higher he climbed, the narrower the road became, until it was little more than a single lane carved into the side of the mountain. On one side, the cliff rose sharply. On the other, it dropped away into nothingness. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. Fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, turning the road ahead into a tunnel of swirling gray. Jake slowed the rig to a crawl, his eyes straining to see the road through the fog. The headlights seemed to be swallowed by the mist, casting an eerie glow on the rocks and trees. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, a burst of static that made Jake jump. He hadn't touched the dial, and the radio had been silent for hours. He reached for the volume knob, but before he could turn it down, a voice came through the speakers, faint, distorted, and echoing, as if from a great distance. "Help me." The voice was barely audible, but it sent a chill down Jake's spine. He leaned closer to the radio, his heart pounding. "Help me." Jake's hands tightened on the wheel. The voice was male, and it sounded desperate. He grabbed the CB mic, responding, "This is Jake Turner. Can you hear me? Where are you?" There was no reply, just more static. Then the voice returned, stronger this time. "Help me. Please, I'm cold." Jake's blood ran cold. The voice was coming from the radio, but the frequency was off, not matching any channel Jake knew. He checked his mirrors, half expecting to see another truck, but the road behind him was empty, swallowed by the fog. The voice crackled again, but this time it was joined by another sound, a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through the cab. Jake's eyes darted to the side mirror, and for a moment, he saw something moving in the fog, something large and dark, keeping pace with the truck. His breath caught in his throat as the shape became clearer, its outline distorted by the mist. It was huge, almost as tall as the truck itself, and it moved with an unnatural loping gait. Jake couldn't make out any details, just the sense of immense size and power, the kind of thing that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. The growl deepened, and the truck shuddered, as if something had struck it from behind. Jake slammed his foot on the accelerator, the engine roaring as the truck surged forward, tires skidding on the loose gravel. The shape in the fog moved faster, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears as he wrestled the truck around a sharp turn, the wheels barely gripping the road. He could feel the creature's presence growing stronger, the cab filling with a suffocating cold. The radio crackled again, the voice now screaming, "Help me! Don't leave me here!" Jake gritted his teeth, refusing to look back. He had to get off this road, had to outrun whatever was out there. He could see the end of the pass up ahead, where the road straightened out and began its descent. If he could just make it there, he might be able to lose the thing in the fog. But as he rounded the final bend, the truck lurched violently to the side. The passenger side tires skidded on loose gravel, and for a heart-stopping moment, Jake thought the whole rig was going to tip over the edge. He yanked the wheel hard, righting the truck, just as it teetered on the brink. The creature was gone. The fog was lifting, revealing the road ahead, clear and empty. Jake didn't slow down until he was miles away from Coldwater Pass, his hands trembling on the wheel. He pulled into the first rest stop he found, parking the rig and stumbling out into the cold night air. Jake never spoke about what happened on Coldwater Pass. He avoided the route from then on, sticking to the safer highways. But every time he drove through the mountains, he could feel the weight of the fog pressing in, hear the faint crackle of static on the radio, and catch glimpses of something large and dark moving in the shadows. and he knew that whatever haunted Coldwater Pass was still out there, waiting for the next trucker foolish enough to take that road.